Hi, it's Patrick Hutzel from IntensiveCareHotline.com, where we help families of critically ill patients in intensive care to improve their lives instantly so that you can exercise power, influence decision making, and stay in control fast of your and your critically ill loved one's destiny. Thank you for watching this video, and in this video I'll show you the proven system to avoid the 3 most dangerous mistakes that you are making but you are unaware of if your loved one is a critically ill patient in intensive care. Avoid these mistakes and you can exercise more control, power, and gain influence fast in an environment where other people are in control. If you get this one wrong and you lose control fast during a time where your critically ill loved one and your family needs you the most, remember, it's hard to ask the right questions without the behind the scenes insights that I'm giving you here. This video gives you a summary and takeaway action steps that'll show you how to stay in control of the situation and gain control, power, and influence fast. Okay, welcome to another video in IntensiveCareHotline.com's video series. And once again, congratulations for taking action in getting informed and taking control. Just by doing that, you stand out from the rest of the families in intensive care, and it will give you an edge when dealing with the challenges, difficulties, and frustrations in intensive care. Our video series will help you finding your voice in the jungle of complexities surrounding intensive care. By the end of this video, you will have discovered 3 killer tips and strategies how to prevent mistakes you are making while your loved one is critically ill in intensive care. You will have discovered how to eliminate fear, frustration, stress, struggle, and vulnerability. How much time you should spend in intensive care with your critically ill loved one. What exact questions you need to ask the doctors and the nurses in each situation. You also discover what you need to know, understand, and ask before your critically ill loved one gets discharged to a hospital ward. You will discover how many people in intensive care die, and therefore you will understand the odds for your critically ill loved one. You also discover why staying positive is so important. You will learn how to speak the secret intensive care language so that doctors and nurses know straight away that you are an insider and that you know and understand what's really happening in intensive care. You will learn how to make meaning out of your situation during a time of crisis. You will learn what quality of life really is and why it's only perceived, and why it's so important that you and your family don't panic no matter what. Chances are that if you have come to this video, you are seeking answers to your questions, because your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and you, your loved one, and your family are experiencing one of the most stressful and traumatic times in your life, and you are probably feeling overwhelmed, challenged, frustrated, vulnerable, and fearful. But remember, knowledge is power, and in this report you get a lot of behind the scenes insight and takeaway action steps that will help you to stay in control, have more power, and have more influence whilst your loved one is a critically ill patient in intensive care. And looking for answers is a step in the right direction, and in this video you'll get some very useful advice on how to improve your family's and your critically ill loved one's situation. So, give yourself a pat on your back for taking action. Well done. I also hope that you have read or watched our Instant Impact Report, which hopefully gave you more insights and coping strategies already, and I hope that the Instant Impact Report or video served you well. In this video, you will get even more insights of how you can effectively deal with your fears, frustrations, your struggles, your vulnerability, and how you can turn the situation around so that you feel powerful, in control, influential, to the point where you are mentally well positioned and mentally strong so that you can deal with adversity. After more than 15 years critical care nursing experience, I had the privilege to guide many critically ill patients and their families through one of the most traumatic, challenging and frustrating times in their lives, whilst they have been going through the stressful journey in intensive care. You see, in most cases, being admitted to intensive care is more often than not a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and neither your critically ill loved one, you and your family are planning to come to intensive care. Why would you? Out of all places, you certainly don't want to be in intensive care. The fact of the matter is, however, that being a critically ill patient in intensive care brings massive challenges for your loved one, for you, and for your family. You and your family are very likely out of your comfort zone. You are feeling stressed, frustrated, challenged, and vulnerable. Generally speaking, people are different, and in intensive care, I meet people from all walks of life, and I meet people from different backgrounds and from different nationalities. I meet rich people, I meet poor people, I meet young people, I meet old people, I meet people with a supportive family, and I meet people with a less supportive family. It doesn't really matter. Regardless of people's background or family dynamics, I have seen pretty much all people making similar mistakes when their loved one is a critically ill patient in intensive care. And more often than not, it's having a direct or indirect negative impact on you, your family, and your loved one who's critically ill. Let's start with the 3 common mistakes that I see over and over again and how you can avoid them. Some of those mistakes that I will be pointing out might be contrary to popular belief, and they might appear to be counterintuitive at first. My clinical experience, however, has shown me that sometimes going against your intuition and against popular beliefs is the right thing to do. So, let's look at mistake number 1. You are spending too much time in intensive care. Now, I'm personally a big believer that critically ill patients in intensive care need their loved ones around in order to get better, or when their critically ill loved one approaches the end of life, because even though most patients can't remember their time in intensive care, they can remember having a family member or friend there that talked to them or just simply held their hand. Whatever the case may be, you need to manage your energy during this stressful and traumatic period in your and your family's life, because otherwise you'll be running out of energy and out of steam fast. Your critically ill loved one is in intensive care, and they are in the best of hands, and once again they won't remember much of their journey. Let the doctors and the nurses take care of your critically ill loved one. That's what they do best. It's much better to save and manage your energy during times when you are out of your comfort zone, as your loved one will need you once they're out of intensive care. Once your loved one is on a ward and is recovering there, that's when they need you the most. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be there, but I have seen far too many family members of critically ill patients staying day and night in intensive care, with the result that they get run down, burned out, and lose energy and steam fast, sometimes to the point of a nervous breakdown. And keep in mind, you might have children, you might have parents, you might have a spouse, or you might have a professional life that you may or may not be able to neglect. Whatever the case may be, in your unique circumstances, number 1 priority is the safety and sanity of you and your family. And in order to stay sane and safe during this traumatic and stressful period in your family's and in your critically ill loved one's life, you must take care of yourself first. And you do that by getting a good night's sleep, by eating properly, and by getting regular breaks. I know that this is easier said than done. However, it's so crucial for you and your family's emotional and physical well-being that you don't spend day and night in intensive care. Your loved one will feel when you are there, and he or she will also feel that less physical presence doesn't necessarily mean less emotional presence. In fact, by getting regular breaks, your loved one will feel your rejuvenation, your presence, and your engagement, and they will feel the good vibes coming from you and your family if they're all looked after. Less may actually be more in the true sense of the meaning. Quantity time spent doesn't necessarily equal quality time spent. And the intensive care unit is only a phone call away. It's a 24/7 environment, and the intensive care staff understand and appreciate that you are ringing a few times a day if you're not physically present. The ICU staff do understand and appreciate when you are ringing in the middle of the night to get an update on your critically ill loved one's condition. Now, in some very tragic and traumatic instances, you will stay the night in intensive care. However, don't let this become a regular occurrence. If your loved one is critically ill in intensive care for many days or many weeks, or if you need to do it, take turns with other family members. I have seen so many family members run down physically and emotionally if they spend too much time in intensive care, especially if the recovery of your loved one in intensive care is lengthy and not straightforward. By lengthy, I mean 10 days or longer, because I have seen that usually around the day 10 mark, people are getting even more nervous and anxious, and it's usually also around the day 10 mark where the first signs of physical and emotional exhaustion show up. The other advantage when you are managing your and your family's energy and sanity well is that whenever you are dealing with intensive care staff, whether that be doctors, nurses, the receptionists, or anybody else in the unit, everybody can feel that you have internal resources and strength left inside you, and that whatever else the situation might be throwing at you, you and your family can deal with it. This will help your loved one as well. Intensive care is an unpredictable, volatile, and highly charged environment, and good and bad things happen. Sometimes things are not straightforward and don't go as planned. Patience sometimes is the key to being a patient. So, let's quickly look at a summary and some takeaway action steps. So, take regular breaks to recharge your batteries so that you can be fully physically and emotionally present, so that you can engage when you are visiting your critically ill loved one. Remember, it's all about quality time, not quantity time. Take turns with other family members and friends so that you can split the time into manageable chunks of time that don't turn into overwhelm. If you think you need time out, leave and stay in contact via phone with intensive care staff. They will answer all of your questions and concerns 24 hours a day. If you can, look after your children or elderly parents. If you can't, have other family members or friends take care of them. Make sure everybody's physical and emotional well-being is taken care of, because it'll help everybody in the long run. Also, bond with other people in intensive care that go through a similar experience. Share your experience with them and they'll share their experience with you. Help and support each other. Build informal groups, and you learn, and you may be able to put things in perspective by learning from other people's ordeals. Also, let the intensive care staff know when you are struggling with having to juggle a family, and also when you are feeling the duty to be with your critically ill loved one as often as you can. The intensive care staff will understand, and they will usually refer you to a social worker. It's nothing to be ashamed of to struggle in times of crisis, and if you do, let other people know so that they can help. And finally, listen to non-clinical staff such as social workers. They very often give good advice what to do in a highly stressful and traumatic situation. Let's move on to mistake number 2 you are making, which is you're not asking the right questions and you're not making up your own mind. Now, if your loved one is a critically ill patient in intensive care, There are a number of scenarios that may have occurred prior to your loved one being admitted to intensive care. The 3 most common and general scenarios that you must know so that you can ask the right questions are: number 1, your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and it's life-threatening. Number 2, your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and it's not life-threatening, and it's very likely that your loved one will recover with the outlook of a good or normal quality of life. And number 3, your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and it's not life-threatening, and the general perception is that a good or normal quality of life may not be achieved after discharge out of intensive care. So I will be referring to those 3 examples as we go along, and I will refer to them as example number 1, 2 and 3. By the time you are watching this video, you probably know in which of the 3 categories, 1, 2 or 3, your critically ill loved one fits in, and with the action steps you are learning, you can put the right questions forward to the intensive care team, and you will also be able to ask the right questions for you and for your family in order to deal effectively with the situation. So let's have a quick look into the minds of doctors and nurses in intensive care. In order to ask the right questions in each of the 3 scenarios, you must know a little bit more about how an intensive care unit operates, and you must know a little bit more about the mindset of the people working in an environment like intensive care, and then we'll get back to how you should proceed in each scenario. So let's take you behind the scenes, so to speak, for a little while before we zoom out again in order to answer your questions. Now, most people working in intensive care, whether they are doctors, nurses, physiotherapists and support staff, have one thing in common: they tend to be optimists. In more than 15 years critical care nursing experience, I haven't seen many people who are pessimists working in an intensive care environment, generally speaking. If I have seen pessimists working in intensive care, they didn't last too long. Generally, people love working in intensive care. They get tremendous internal reward and satisfaction out of what they are doing. So, for you who's coming into this stressful, busy, noisy, and sometimes highly charged environment, often totally unprepared, your world is tumbling down. You are out of your comfort zone and you feel vulnerable. And of course your world is tumbling down, because your loved one has just been admitted to intensive care. It is here where 2 totally different paradigms or frames of mind are meeting. On the one hand, it's very often distressed families of a critically ill patient who are experiencing one of their most traumatic and most stressful times in their lives. And on the other hand, you have the gentle, caring and calm nursing and medical staff who love to interact with both the patients and their families during one of their most stressful times in their lives. It is here where you can probably sense that people working in intensive care, generally speaking, love what they do. So, what does this have to do with what questions you should ask in each scenario that I mentioned before, scenarios 1, 2 and 3? A lot. It has to do a lot with it. Now that you've had some insight in how people working in intensive care operate, now we can drill down into your questions. So let's just quickly look at how many people die in intensive care every year. And I can tell you now, you'd be surprised about the answer. Let's look at question number 1, where your loved one is critically ill in intensive care and it is life-threatening. Now, most families of critically ill patients in intensive care think that death is imminent and can happen at any time, and they also think that a lot of people die in intensive care. Whilst this may be true in some instances, keep in mind that intensive care is a fairly well-controlled environment, and if your loved one made it through the emergency department into intensive care, he or she has gone a long way already. In order for you to determine the right questions to ask if your loved one is critically ill with a life-threatening disease or injury, you must know the following facts and figures. So, in 2010, in the ANZICS report from Australia and New Zealand, ICU mortality during first ICU admissions was 6.6%, which means basically 66 out of 1,000 admissions have died. So, compared to the overall hospital mortality of 10.2%, which means that 102 out of 1,000 admissions on the ward actually die. So the number of people dying in intensive care is less compared to the number of people dying on a ward. I believe that these numbers are not too bad, considering the stuff that's coming through the ICU doors generally, and also considering that the patient population is getting older, as we are all living in times where people are living longer. So, let's start with the good news. In intensive care, we can pretty much control all organs, starting from the lungs, the heart, the liver, and the kidneys, almost for an indefinite period. That means we can keep people alive for long periods of time. There are some instances where we can't keep people alive, but once again, if your loved one has gone through the emergency department, they have taken a big step already. But here are the bad news. There's one organ we can't control in intensive care, and that's the brain. Brain and head injuries can be very nasty, and the brain has a life on its own, and everybody in intensive care fears head or brain injuries, as we simply can't control the brain. It's nasty stuff. Furthermore, it's also very important that you stay positive. It's basically intensive care 101 for families. You must stay positive. I know that this is easier said than done, but it's absolutely vital that you stay positive in such a critical situation. It helps you, your critically ill loved one, and your family. Positive vibes can work wonder. Those positive vibes create positive energy, and your critically ill loved one and the rest of your family can feel those positive vibes. I remember a few patients in the past that I was privileged to look after, and they were very sick patients with an extremely poor prognosis, but everybody kept on fighting and kept up their spirits, and it certainly helped for those patients and their families. The other case I remember vividly was this gentleman that I was privileged to look after, who was in his mid-70s. The gentleman, after cardiac surgery, ended up resuscitated for about 1 hour on an open chest, and he was given very little chances to survive his ordeal. And I clearly remember that he was in an induced coma for many weeks before an attempt to wake him up was actually undertaken. His prognosis was generally very poor, as he had multiple comorbidities, and the medical and the nursing team didn't have too many expectations for this gentleman to recover. The family of the gentleman always stressed from day one that he's a fighter, and that he has been through so many things in the past that they don't want to give up on him, and that he may recover. The family was also realistic about the outcome, and they were prepared to let nature take its course if that would have been the case. Cutting a long story short, this gentleman miraculously recovered and went to the ward after about 8 weeks in intensive care. This story, to me, clearly underlined the importance of you and your family knowing your loved one, and also listening to your gut and to your instincts. Be realistic and also prepare yourself for the worst, but do not ignore your gut feeling and your intuition, because your gut never lies. The intensive care staff have the medical, the nursing, and the technical skills to look after your critically ill loved one, but they don't know your loved one as well as you do. You know best how your loved one deals with adversity. So, what exactly are some of the magic questions that you need to ask? Without knowing exactly why your critically ill loved one has been admitted to intensive care, but knowing that they are in a life-threatening situation, the questions that very few people ask if their loved one is a critically ill patient in intensive care with a life-threatening injury or disease are: what are the chances of survival in percent? Is it 50-50, 20-80, 30-70, or whatever other number people may give you? But you will get a rough understanding of where your critically ill loved one is heading. The other question you need to ask is, if my critically ill loved one is going to die, is death imminent, or is it going to be a quote-unquote controlled death, with time for us to say our goodbyes and have peace of mind? The other question you need to look at is, if death is imminent, can we have a private room in the intensive care unit to spend time with our loved one in privacy and dignity? Remember, in some instances, your loved one's end of life might be approached in a home care environment as well, if they have a tracheostomy and require mechanical ventilation for life support. Check out intensivecareathome.com.au for more information. The other question you need to ask is, if death is imminent and unavoidable, can we choose the time of discontinuation of life support? I personally believe you should, as the time of death should be in your hands if possible, and not in the hands of bed managers who try to manage admissions and discharge times of patients. What I'm really trying to say here is that the time of death should not be a time determined by bed management pressures. Period. By you having an awareness of possible bed management issues, as generally intensive care beds are a scarce, precious and expensive resource, you can ask the right questions and also influence the outcome. Furthermore, keep in mind that the intensive care team generally don't tell you the best possible outcome is going to happen. Even though they are optimists, they don't want to be held liable for any positive outcomes they might promise, and those positive outcomes may or may not occur. Also, listen to your gut and know your loved one. How well do they deal with adversity? Do they think that you have the strength to pull through? You should be asking this question irrespective of what picture the doctors and the nurses are painting. So this is the end of video number 1, and let's continue below with video number 2. Thank you.